Welcome, fellow beekeepers. This is Jamie Walters, OSBA's Maumee Valley Director and News Editor. I'm pleased to announce OSBA's new live webinar training series. Live sessions are recorded on the second and fourth Sunday of each month, 7 p.m. through Zoom conference call. You're welcome to attend by making a reservation on OSBA's website at www.ohiostatebeekeepers.org. Go to the events page and scroll down to the event you would like to attend. Confirm your RSVP by filling out the registration form with your city, state, name, and email address. Approximately 2 hours before the beginning of Sunday's webinar, an active Zoom link will be sent to your email address. Each training session will be recorded and posted on the following Sunday on OSBA's new YouTube channel. You can find it at Ohio State Beekeepers Association. You're welcome to subscribe and be sure to click the bell to be alerted each time we upload a new video. Each month's speakers and presentation will be posted on the Facebook page, by direct email to registered and paid members, and our website at ohiostatebeekeepers.org. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at editor@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. And now on to our previous recorded webinar.
Good evening, everybody. I keep getting an error that my internet is unstable, even though everything is shut off and my family is now on the road. They left, so they're not taking up internet. So if I do start going out a little bit, please type in the chat and let me know if things are a little bit spotty. Can you hear me okay right now? Jamie, am I coming through okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Well, good evening. I'm so excited to be here. And Jamie, thank you so much for the invitation to present on my favorite topic. I'm Danae Wolfe. I work with Ohio State University Extension. And Jamie, you mentioned Denise Ellsworth's name earlier. Denise Ellsworth used to be the Summit County Extension educator, very interested in pollinators. When Denise took her position with the pollinator program with OSU Extension, I actually took her position in Summit County. So it was about 8 years ago. And then 3 years later, I ended up moving into a statewide position teaching educational technology to our faculty and staff across the state in Extension. So I teach our faculty how to teach online. And in the age of COVID, that means a lot. And I've been very, very busy frantically trying to catch everybody up. So tonight we're going to be talking about macro garden photography. So outside of my professional role working for Ohio State, I am a macro insect and spider photographer and conservation educator. So I've been doing this work really since I was a young girl. I got into photography when I was around 12 years old. Absolutely hated bugs at that time, like loathed, especially spiders, but really all bugs. I just found them to be super creepy and awful in every way. And then I went to college and got my undergraduate degree in environmental studies. And my photography, I was getting more serious about that. And then I got my first macro lens, and that changed everything. All of a sudden, I went from photographing flowers to photographing the bugs on those flowers, and it just kind of evolved very rapidly into this quirky obsession with insects and spiders. And today I love all bugs except house centipedes because they still freak me out a little bit. But all other bugs I absolutely adore, and I'm going to teach you how to take photos of them with a little bit of budget techniques. Macro photography can get a little expensive. There's a lot of highly technical equipment that you can purchase for macro photography. And I went down that route 10 years ago. I invested a lot of money in macro photography setups only to find out that I was not getting the results that I wanted. So I ended up doing a lot of research and experimentation and found some setups that were much cheaper and offered high magnification and just really unique, awesome setups. So that's what I'm going to be sharing about today. So my first question to you all is, what is macro photography? And I do kind of want this to be participatory. I do like to present in a less formal way. So if you have access to that chat box, whether you're on a phone or a tablet or a computer, feel free to open that chat up and just start typing in some answers. What is macro photography to you? What does it mean? One step above micro, that's a good way to explain it. So micro is like super, super small, because we start to think about like microscopic. So you can photograph things like plant cells or plant diseases. Any other ideas? Super close zoom, Randy, that's a great response. Large images of small objects. Yeah. So there's actually kind of a highly technical definition of macro photography, and that is photography that results in a 1-to-1 magnification ratio. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time breaking this definition down. I don't want to get too technical, but I do think it's helpful to kind of understand what macro is and how it works, because that, I think, helps present a better idea of how the equipment that I'm going to be sharing with you works. So imagine you are photographing a small bee. This is your camera. You can see the bee there on the screen. And this little black line over here on the far left of the screen represents your camera's sensor. Now, your camera sensor lives in the back of your camera here. It's a highly sensitive piece of equipment that lives inside of your camera. I would not recommend ever trying to touch it or play with that or clean it yourself unless you are really good with that, because if you touch it, you can damage it very, very easily. So that thing lives in the back of your camera, and it's what helps capture light as light enters your camera. So getting back to this definition of 1-to-1 magnification ratio, so we're photographing this bee. So what does 1-to-1 magnification ratio mean? It basically means that that bee is represented as life size in relation to your camera sensor. So if the black box is your camera sensor, the lens that you're using optical elements, so the glass elements that help us magnify different things, those optical elements plus the distance that you are to your subject help magnify that subject. So anything that is magnified so much so that it's represented as life size or greater, because in reality, this bee could be represented as much, much larger as it's projected onto that sensor, that's macro photography. And like I said, the reason why I like to explain this is because it does, I think, help with an understanding of how some of this equipment works from a physics standpoint. And I am no good at physics, so I have to break these concepts down for myself to truly understand it. So we're going to kind of go into, and Sherry asked, is the macro sensor inside the camera? Yeah, so the sensor lives inside the camera. So if I were to take my lens off of my camera, there is a way, so this is an SLR, so a digital SLR, so single lens reflex camera. There is a mirror also that kind of lives on an angle inside my camera. There is a way for me, if I wanted to clean the sensor, for me to pop that mirror up. And when the mirror is up, you can see the sensor of your camera. A good note on that in relation to bugs, and one of the biggest reasons why we don't like to take our lenses off in the field, if you're working with like a mirrorless camera or an SLR camera, any camera that has interchangeable lenses, things can get inside your camera pretty easily. So oftentimes you'll see like dust specks in your photos. If you're accustomed to like removing your lenses in locations where there might be dust, that could even be inside your house. It's a good reason why you should always shut your camera off when you change your lenses, and a good reason why you should change your lenses in a space that's just clean. So many, many years ago when I was in college, I was doing an internship for the Portage Park District here in Ohio. And I went out, I was photographing an event where people were bird watching at the Ravenna Arsenal, for anybody who has had the opportunity to be there. It's really cool. And I noticed something crawling across my camera. So as I'm looking through my viewfinder, photographing things, there's like a bug. So what's the first thing you do, right? I'm looking at the lens of my camera, is there a bug on my lens? And next thing I know, there's 2 bugs crawling across. And I think at any given time over the course of the next 24 hours, I saw as many as 7 little bugs crawling across my camera. I sent it in to Canon to figure out what the heck was happening. And it turns out there was a beetle infestation inside my camera. So I really like bugs, but not that much. And that represented just something wild. And I can't imagine that happens very often. So all the more reason why you should make sure you're changing your lenses in a safe, clean environment. So that was just a fun tip for you. So we're going to go through a couple of different primary techniques today. A lot of the techniques will focus on techniques that you can use on a mirrorless or on an SLR camera, but we will talk a little bit about mobile macro photography too. So just so I can get a sense, how many of you have a camera with interchangeable lenses? And if you see the participants tab someplace on your screen, you can click that, and you should have the option to, if you go to more, you can raise your hand. Give me a little hand raise. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Thumbs up works too. Ooh, lots of people have SLR cameras. Ooh, that's awesome. All right. So for those of you who don't, like I said, we will also be talking a little bit about the mobile macro photography, because I understand not everybody has a big camera. So we're going to talk about traditional macro lenses, extension tubes, reverse lens, which is my absolute favorite technique and the one that I use almost 100% of the time these days. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a conversation about mobile macro. We'll talk a little bit about lighting and different tips and techniques to take great photos. I know many of you are probably interested in photographing bees, right? I photograph a little bit of everything. So a lot of the photos won't be necessarily specific to bees or honeybees, but they'll kind of represent the whole gamut of different insects and spiders that you can find in your landscape. So if you have questions, again, feel free to pop those into the chat, because we do get a little bit technical at times. I want to make sure that I'm responding to your questions as we are in that technique, because it might help everybody else. If you have a question about something, chances are somebody else is probably thinking the same thing. So let's start with macro lenses. How many of you have a macro lens? Macro lenses are fantastic. They are not a budget macro photography technique, at least not in most situations. So I love macro lenses. They're what I like to call grab and go as it relates to macro photography. You can grab this lens, you throw it on your camera, and you can just start shooting. You can put your camera fully in automatic. You can put your focus on automatic on the lens, and you can just be off taking fantastic photos. The problem is macro lenses range from anywhere from a couple $100 all the way up into the like 13, 15, 1600, depending on what lens you're looking for. They do range in different focal lengths. So you can get 50 millimeter, 60, 100, 180, 200. This one, I'm a Canon user myself. So this is the 100 millimeter Canon. I have also had the 180 millimeter Canon, which is fabulous lens, heavy, bulky, not cheap, but produces stunning images. There are also dedicated macro lenses that are made specifically for macro photography. You cannot use them really for other types of photography because they lack what we call infinity focus. So you can't like photograph a bug super close up and then pull that camera up and take a photo of a landscape. They're just not lenses that function in that way. So the Canon MPE65 produces 5:1 magnification ratio all the way, so it's 1:1 all the way up to 5:1, meaning 5 times greater than traditional 1:1 macro. And then there's a cheaper one, that's the Laowa, I think it's cheaper. The Laowa 60 millimeter ultra macro, which does 2:1, up to 2:1 magnification. Also a great lens. I have a lot of friends that use this and just love it. So again, the great thing about these lenses is you just throw them on your camera and you're off and running, and you can take some great photos. Usually, but not always, it's helpful to use some sort of light as well. So we will have a conversation in a bit about types of macro flashes. This is a little damselfly. I probably was using my twin light flash to take this photo with nice illumination here. You can see all the little hairs on the damselfly's face. But it's a pretty bulky setup. So imagine having this big heavy lens, and I know you can't feel it, but you can trust me, it's a little bit heavy. Plus you have a big heavy like lighting setup on top of that. It's a lot. So here's a dragonfly. You can see the reflection of the flash in each of the dragonfly's eyes and a bit of a hot spot along his back as well. Another downside to using flash, we'll talk about the importance of diffusion. Here's a lily that I took actually inside a glass house during the day. So when you use a flash, you get what's called flash fall off because light travels. And I'll try to explain this. Again, my physics is no good. But this is another important point of macro photography. When you use a flash, so artificial light travels in sort of this cone shape. So you have the point of light coming out of your flash, and as it's coming away from the camera, it travels in a cone and it gets bigger, it gets more diffuse. And if there's nothing in the immediate background to basically catch that light and then reflect back to the camera, you'll end up getting a really just dark black background. So macro photography, if you see black backgrounds a lot, sometimes they seem really artificial. Like, did somebody like cut that subject out and just put an artificial black background on? No, that's actually just a natural phenomenon that happens when you're using a flash. So the sunlight's coming in and hitting this water lily and illuminating it really nicely, but then everything else is just stark black, which can kind of create a really nice artistic look to some shots. But it can also really wash out a lot of details, particularly details in darker subjects. So sometimes it's really nice to have a nice bright background, which again, we'll talk about all this stuff throughout the evening. Any questions about traditional macro lenses? I don't want to spend a ton of time on those just because they're not really what I would consider budget, unless you can find like a used one for, you know, pretty inexpensively. So I do want to talk about extension tubes, which is where I really started to get into higher magnification macro on a budget. So extension tubes are really great, fairly inexpensive, and you can get really great results from them. So extension tubes are literally just hollow tubes. There is no optical elements or glass elements in this tube. This is a Canon tube, more expensive than some of the off-brand ones. Quite frankly, it's probably not worth the extra cost in buying brand name when you can buy some of the cheaper ones. And I'm going to type in some of the names of some of the cheaper ones. So ProMaster sells a set of extension tubes. It comes with 3 tubes, and Kenko, again, that's in the chat, sells a set too. Typically you can get like a 12 millimeter, 24, 25 millimeter, and like a 35 or 37 millimeter. And then you can combine them. So what this does is it decreases the minimum focal distance so you can get physically closer to your subject, but it also, you mount this in between your camera lens. If this is my lens, I'm gonna mount this in between my camera and the lens. So it's basically just pulling the lens further away from the sensor. So that's why we had that little physics lesson at the beginning. If you have ever been to a presentation where the presenter is using a projector to project their presentation up onto a screen or wall, think about what happens when you pull that projector further away from the wall. It magnifies that image, right? It makes the image bigger. So by pulling your lens further away from the sensor, basically in this case, the wall, it's magnifying the image, or enlarging it. Magnify is the wrong word. It's enlarging that image. So it basically creates a sense of magnification. So like I said, they come in a lot of different variety, different sizes. There are super, super cheap tubes that do not retain that communication between the camera and the lens. I don't recommend using those ones because they're so cheap and flimsy that, especially if you throw it on a big expensive lens like this lens would break those tubes right off of your camera. So do invest in the ones that contain the electrical connectivity, because then your camera can communicate to the lens. You can change things like your aperture. If you don't have that connectivity, you won't be able to change things like your aperture. And that's really important for things like your depth of field, which gets really, really narrow when you are photographing super close up. So why am I showing you a can of sugar? This was what I had available in my office when I was doing some testing with extension tubes. I just kind of wanted to show the magnification that you can achieve with different lenses. So I threw my Nifty 50, my 50 millimeter prime lens, a fixed focal length lens, on my camera, and I got as close as I physically could to this can of sugar and snapped a photo. And this was how magnified I could get. So decent photo, not super close. Then I threw my 25 millimeter extension tube on that setup. So I have a tube between that 50 millimeter and my camera. And this is now how close you can get. Now notice how your depth of field is so narrow. Because that can is round, you start to lose the focus when you're getting further away. So as that roundness kind of goes away from the camera, you're losing the edges of focus, but it's focused there right in the center. But look at the difference in magnification between those two photos. With one 25 millimeter extension tube, which you can get for a pretty decent amount. I think the Canon ones run like 140, but again, that's just for one lens or for one tube. But the Kenko and ProMaster, I think you can get the full set for around $100. So you can throw that tube on something like, I think this was taken with a 24 millimeter prime lens, which is one of my favorites to use with this setup. You can throw that on a 24 millimeter lens. The Canon 24 millimeter pancake lens, like the profile is this big. It's a tiny, tiny little lightweight lens. And all of a sudden you have a great throw around lens for taking photos of whatever. 24 millimeters is great. Plus you throw on the extension tube and now you have a macro setup too. So some of these photos were taken down in Costa Rica. This was a setup that I took to Costa Rica with me a number of years ago because I wanted a super lightweight setup. I didn't want to deal with the bulk of having all of these macro lenses and all of these other lenses. So I had my camera, my extension tube, my 24 millimeter lens, and that's it. And then I have a flash diffuser. So you've probably seen, as I've showed you this camera, I have a great big diffuser, which is just a big hunk of plastic that helps diffuse the light coming off of my flash. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So here's a nice little leaf hopper. Again, you can see the detail. I mean, it's not the perfect setup, but considering what it is, it gives you really, really nice results. So if you're just looking for like a nice lightweight setup to take out and photograph your bees with or your hives with, you can get really, really wonderful results with extension tubes, and they're not terribly expensive. And chances are you probably already have a good lens that you can use that with. You can find, a lot of people ask me like, what's the formula for knowing what magnification I can achieve with different focal lengths of lenses and different focal length sizes of extension tubes. There are some really specific algorithms and formulas that you can use to figure that out. There are websites. So if you just search like formula for identifying magnification with an extension tube, you have to type in your focal length, you have to type in the length of tube that you're using, and a couple of other numbers, and then it'll spit out the magnification that you can achieve. This is around a 1-to-1 magnification ratio. So it's not super high magnification, but it's getting you that macro detail. Any questions about tubes? Tubes are a really wonderful option, nice and cheap. They're not my favorite because the reverse lens is my favorite technique of all time. But tubes are a really, really wonderful, especially like introductory macro. It's just a really great setup. So again, keep those questions coming into the chat if you have them. So let's talk a little bit about the reverse lens technique. So the reverse lens technique basically means that you are reverse mounting a lens on your camera with the use of a special adapter. It seems counterintuitive, but the wider the angle of the lens, the greater magnification that you will achieve. Some people ask, well, can I reverse mount my macro lens? If you reverse mount a lens that can already achieve 1-to-1 magnification ratio, you're not getting any added benefit from that whatsoever. So again, the wider the angle, the greater the magnification. Personally, I use a 40mm prime lens. Some people use zoom lenses. I find those to be a little bit too cumbersome, but they do in theory work. I've never actually used them myself, but I know plenty of people who have said that they use them. So I'm going to talk about two types of reverse lens, the manual, which is where I got my start from, and then I'll talk about the auto. So manual reverse lens is basically using an old manual lens. So I got my start with this technique in using this old Canon FD mount 28mm prime lens. So this lens was manufactured back in, I want to say it was like 1973 or 1974. So why am I using an almost 50-year-old lens to do modern macro photography? The reason is because when you reverse mount this lens on your camera can't communicate to your lens. So you have no way of changing that aperture. So these old lenses, unlike modern lenses, have an aperture ring. So as I move this back and forth, and hopefully you can see this, as I move this back and forth, you can see that aperture, which is the opening of the hole on the lens. You can see that getting bigger and smaller. Again, with a modern lens, you don't have an aperture ring. Some lenses do, like some very specific lenses do. In fact, I have a wide angle macro lens that does have an aperture ring. It's a manual lens, but most modern lenses don't have that. So the benefit is now you have complete control over your aperture, whereas you wouldn't with an auto lens or a modern lens. Now, the huge downside to this is when you look through your camera's viewfinder with a traditional setup, when you have a traditional modern lens on your camera, when you look through your viewfinder, you're actually seeing the view with the aperture wide open. So your lens doesn't stop down the aperture to what you have it set for until you hit the shutter. Now on a lot of cameras, there's a preview button. So there's a tiny little preview button like buried in the corner of my camera down here. If I touch that button, or if I press down that button as I'm looking through my viewfinder, my aperture will stop down for me. It's just a preview. So it doesn't take a photo or anything. It just previews what the aperture looks like. My viewfinder gets really, really dark unless my aperture is already set to be wide open. My sweet spot tends to be f11 for a lot of the photography that I do. So when I have my aperture set to f11, I'll set it here on this lens, it gets pretty dark. So if I'm looking through this lens and my aperture is stopped down because there's no communication between my camera, it stays stopped down. So when I'm looking through my viewfinder, it's really difficult to find your focus because it's just a darkened view. The other Disadvantage to this setup is because your lens is mounted backwards, all of the guts of your lens are exposed. Now, this is a lens that I don't care much about because literally the only reason why I'm using it is for the optical elements. I don't care about all these little connections, unless of course a bug gets in there and lays eggs, and now I have like a little infestation of beetles in my camera again. But in most situations, I couldn't care less about the guts of this lens being exposed. So it's not that big of a deal. Now, I do have this little ring, because you're probably thinking, how do you mount this thing on your camera? Some people literally duct tape the lens backwards to their camera. I probably wouldn't recommend the duct tape route because you can get one of these, it's called a reversing ring, for like $10 or $12. I don't think I've ever found one of these in a camera store. So typically I buy this either on Amazon or B&H or eBay. So the two sizes of the reversing ring that you have to be aware of, the one size is going to be the filter size, the filter like thread size on the end of your camera. So if you're getting what's it called? Like your little filter, your UV filter to protect your lens, it's the size of that. So you screw that side into the lens, or you throw it on the desk. You screw that size into your lens, and then the other side is your camera lens mount. So I use a Canon, it's an EF mount. I use a Canon 90D for a lot of my work, so it's a Canon EF mount. And then that just mounts directly onto my camera. And now I have a really great reverse lens setup. So John asked, how do I determine my sweet spot? It's going to be different depending on what your camera and your lens setup is. I find that f11 for my aperture gives me just enough depth of field that I can get a good part of the insect in focus or spider in focus. Now, a lot of different insects have different depths to them, right? So if I'm photographing something like the face of a jumping spider, I can usually get the eyes in focus, but I usually can't get the spider's like pedipalps in focus unless I'm doing a focus stack where I'm stacking multiple photos, each one with a different focal point. So I find that f11 is enough to get like a lot of the details. Anything greater than f11 where I would get a lot more depth of field and I start to get some diffraction issues. So once your aperture, once that opening in your lens becomes so small, the light comes in and then it kind of shoots off in a weird angle. And what it creates is some softness in your image. So that softness, that diffraction issue is going to look different depending on the lens that you're using. For me, it's around f11. So that's how I define my sweet spot. And that's just through experimentation, right? So here are some of the types of shots that you can take with, and again, this setup, super cheap. I think I bought this lens off of eBay for around probably $35 or $40, more expensive than you would think for an almost 50-year-old lens, but still far cheaper than the 1600 I spent on my Canon 180 macro lens. So, and then the reversing ring again is like 10 or 12 bucks. So you have a really great setup here for around $50 or $60. And if you know of anybody who was into photography in the film days, or if you yourself were a photographer in the film days, you might have some of these manual lenses laying around. They're really fantastic. So some other disadvantages, because I kind of paint this beautiful picture of like, this is so great and it's so wonderful. One of the greatest disadvantages to the reverse lens technique is just the proximity that you need to be to your subject. So I need to be, and again, this is going to be dependent on the specific setup, but I need to be about 3 inches away from my subject in order to get it into focus, which is pretty darn close for a lot of living creatures, right? Like this paper wasp. And a lot of people think that wasps and hornets and bees can be a little scary. So how do you get close enough to these creatures? Well, you're all beekeepers. So it's about knowing the animal. It's about knowing their behaviors. It's about understanding what's going to upset them. It's about understanding how they move, in which directions they move, what's going to spook them. How close can I get before this thing jumps away? So that's the biggest disadvantage, is just the proximity that you have to be. You also lose infinity focus. And I don't think I mentioned that with extension tubes. With extension tubes and the reverse lens technique, you lose infinity focus on your camera or on your lens. So you're not going to be able to like photograph some really cool bugs and then like lift your camera up and photograph your kids or your grandkids playing in the garden, because you don't have infinity focus anymore. Your focal range is like literally millimeters, and anything outside that millimeter, like few millimeter plane, you're not going to be able to get it into focus. So again, here's a little paper wasp. I remember shooting this at Stan Hewitt Hall up in Akron, and it was on a cool October day. So you know that bees and wasps or their insects, when they're a little bit cold, they're not going to be super mobile, right? So again, it's about knowing the environmental conditions. It's about knowing what's going to help slow them down. Now this guy, or gal, I don't know, is a little ambush bug, one of my favorite insects. I think they look like little prehistoric dinosaurs, but they're super small, even though they look super magnified here. But I love these guys. True bug, that straw-like mouth part you can kind of see tucked under its head. And they are called ambush bugs because, of course, they ambush their prey. And then they stab them with that straw-like mouth part before sucking their juices out. Super endearing, adorable creature. One of my favorites. This one is a little leafcutter bee, and I love photographing leafcutter bees. I think bees and wasps are some of my favorite insects to photograph. Tree hoppers are my absolute favorite insect in general, but then bees, wasps, and jumping spiders I think are my favorite things to photograph because they're so charismatic, especially jumping spiders. They're just such charismatic little creatures. But notice how you can get close enough that you're seeing the little pollen pieces on the hairs on the face. And this isn't even really high magnification. This is probably about 1-to-1 magnification ratio. So as you get into techniques that allow you to get closer and closer, you can really start to highlight some of those incredible details in what you're photographing. This is a little sweat bee. For all of these too, I should mention that I am using a Canon 90D, which has a built-in flash. So I actually have a Canon 5D Mark IV as well. And once you get into the professional cameras, they stop including a built-in flash because they assume that you're using some big fancy flash system, right? And I have the twin light, I have the Canon twin light macro flash. I don't find it to be nearly as beneficial because it's bulky. It's so darn heavy. And there's all these different settings to be aware of. And honestly, I don't like thinking. Like all of that setup, all of like having to understand and use all of that and change all these things, it detracts from my like relationship like to the natural world as I'm photographing. It's kind of hard to describe, but I just feel like it gets in the way of the experience of actually going out and photographing things. So I use my camera's built-in flash, and it's another reason why, and I'll show you as we get into this auto method. I'll show you why I like to use this method so much too, because it works really well in using your camera's flash if you happen to have a camera with a flash like this. So a lot of people ask, like, can I use like a Canon Rebel, right? Like one of the introductory Canon cameras to absolutely, like those are fabulous cameras for this reason. You don't have to have some big professional camera. I know people who use like point and shoot bridge cameras and they get wonderful, wonderful results from there too. Can't use any of these techniques because you don't have interchangeable lenses, but you can still get some really, really great results. So that brings us to this auto or electronic reverse lens method. So a couple of years ago, somebody reached out to me via my website completely randomly, and I owe so much to this stranger because they said, did you know that there's this adapter that you can buy for your camera that allows your camera to communicate to your lens so you can use a modern lens instead of having to use this old, 50-year-old lens. And this 50-year-old lens is great. The optics are wonderful, so nothing against it. But again, that darkened view makes it very difficult to see. So sure enough, I did the research and I found this piece of equipment. It's this thing with this big, weird, like phone wire, like not modern phone, right? Like old school phone. I'm old enough to have had like a corded phone in my house. So there's two pieces that are connected by a wire here. So the one piece is connected to my camera. The other piece sandwiches the lens. So let me just break this apart for you because I feel like it's kind of hard to see all of that. Again, I'm doing what I just said don't do, which is like taking the lens off the camera and then just leaving it sit here. So I am going to try to make sure nothing gets in there. So this piece of equipment is so, so neat. So first of all, here's the lens that I'm using. This is a 40mm Canon pancake lens. It's a prime lens, fixed focal length, no zoom, just 40mm. Look how narrow it is. It's got that beautiful narrow profile. It's super lightweight. I could throw this around. I'm not going to, but good. And then I have this wonderful piece of equipment connected by this cable. This basically sandwiches the lens, mounts it backwards for me, provides a little bit of extension. It's kind of like its own little extension tube here. And then I mount that piece on my camera. This piece of equipment also comes with, remember I talked about those reversing rings earlier? So all of those different sizes of reversing rings. Sets like this normally come with, I think this one came with 7 different sizes of reversing rings. So I could use it with just about any lens that I had. So you basically just screw this all together. Got to find the right way to do it. Put this on your camera, and now your camera can communicate to your lens. So it becomes an automatic system again. So I don't have to worry about that aperture. I can change everything via my camera, which is really quite wonderful. So let's go back to this discussion about this pancake lens. It is so narrow of a lens that it allows me to use my camera's built-in flash, and it doesn't block the light coming from the flash. If this lens setup were any longer than this, and I've tried it with like my Nifty 50, for example, if it's any longer than this, it blocks the light coming from this flash. So it's no good. That's why I love this system so much. Plus it's just super lightweight and small. Now the downside for this, and I hate to say this for anybody who's a Canon user, or I'm sorry, a Nikon user out there, I cannot find any comparable system on the Nikon platform. I don't know what it is. It's something about the physical design of Nikon cameras. You can't find this reversing setup for Nikons. I have found it for Sony. I have found it for Nikon. The good thing is it doesn't matter. If you're using one of these old manual lenses, it doesn't matter what setup you're on, because you can find the reversing rings for a Nikon. You can find the reversing rings for a Sony or for Canon or for whatever. And it doesn't matter what lens you're using because you're literally mounting it backwards. The only thing that matters is the reversing ring. So you can use this setup on just about any camera platform that takes interchangeable lenses. So the benefit is you have the electronic aperture control. And now when you look in your camera, it's a nice bright view because your aperture isn't stopped down because it's communicating to your camera, and it doesn't stop down until you press the shutter. So all of a sudden you can see what you're photographing, which is kind of a really important part of photography, is being able to see what it is that you're photographing and getting that focus point just right. So Jamie asked, who sells that reversing ring that can communicate? So the bad news is the one that I have specifically, I don't believe it's being made anymore, although that might change. It's called the Velo Macrofier adapter, and you can find this from B&H. I think Amazon, I think I actually got it from Amazon. But there is a brand called Meike, M-E-I-K-E, that makes something similar. And again, you should be able to get that. I don't know if B&H has it, but I feel like I've seen it on Amazon. So usually anybody who sells like camera equipment, I tend to go with B&H for a lot of my purchases around camera equipment. Probably not something you're gonna find in a local camera shop, unfortunately. It's just too specific. Any other questions before we get into some examples? So here are some of the examples that you can get with this setup. Pretty similar to the manual route, right? It's kind of the same basic setup. It's just using slightly different equipment. I am still using my built-in flash with the flash diffuser. I've added some additional diffusion over the last year or so, which has been super helpful. And again, I'm super close to these creatures when photographing them. So if you know anything about a dragonfly, you know they're pretty skittish, but you can still get nice and close to them, again, if you understand their behavior and you know how to approach them. So I use my 40mm pancake lens like 99% of the time. Occasionally, if I'm feeling a little bit just adventurous, I will throw on my 24mm pancake lens. It has the exact same profile, the exact same footprint as my 40mm lens, but it's 24mm. It's a wider angle, which means I get a lot more magnification. So I actually get over 2 times the magnification. So this photo was taken with a reverse mount 24mm lens. This got me 2.6 to 1 magnification ratio. So a lot more than that traditional 1-to-1. And these lenses, this 40mm and the 24mm, I think from Canon run around like 125 to 150. And then the Velo Macrofier that I have is about $100. So for about $250, you can get a really, really high magnification macro setup. And again, $250 might not be budget enough for some people. but it's a heck of a lot less than going out and spending $800 or $1,000 or $1,200 on a dedicated macro lens. So that's why I like to go over this technique. So Sherry asked, I don't want to spend a lot of money on cameras. What's the best route? It really kind of depends on what you're comfortable with. I'm a Canon user, and quite frankly, I've been using Canon for like the last, like 14 years, I think. Started off with Nikon in like the film realm, and then very quickly switched to Canon in my college years. And it's what I know best. So I know that the Rebel lineup is really great. The cameras, for an SLR camera, it's probably still going to be at least a couple $100s, but you can probably get something used for a fairly good price. But the Rebels are a great way to start with some of these techniques, like with the reverse lens, because it's a kind of a budget friendly. But there are probably cheaper options too if you get outside the realm of SLR or mirrorless. So you could start to explore like a bridge camera. And a bridge camera is kind of like a bridge between a point and shoot and an SLR. You don't have interchangeable lenses, but you have way more capability and magnification than you would get with just a traditional like point and shoot camera. So John also asked, when you shoot these live creatures, what is your shutter speed? This is a great question. And this gets a little bit tricky because when you are using your built-in flash, this is why like the built-in flash is really wonderful, but it can also be a little bit limiting for setups. So I have what's called every camera with the built-in flash has what's called a max synchronization speed. And it's the maximum shutter speed that you can use that will still allow the flash to sync with the shutter. So anything faster than that, and your shutter could not sync with your flash output, so the flash would be completely obsolete. So I shoot at 1/250th of a second. That's my max sync speed on my Canon 70D and 90D. I feel like on my 5D, it's actually less than that. I think it's 1/200th of a second. So just to put that into perspective, 1/250th of a second sounds really fast. It's not. It's not terribly fast. However, you're using a flash, and by using that outburst of light, in a sense, you freeze motion. So if you were trying to photograph, and the reason for that is because, let me try to explain that again. It's physics, so I might not do a good job of explaining this. But if you're photographing a bug, your bug's like right here. You are so close to that thing. If you did not use any sort of external lighting, so if you weren't using a flash or like a really bright light, you would have no way of seeing that insect. So even if the insect does move a little bit or the spider moves a little bit, you will have only captured the moment where the flash bursts. And even if it moves, you won't have captured it because it will have been too dark after the flash goes away. So I hope I'm explaining that okay. So 1/250th, even though it's not very fast, it's fast enough, unless you're trying to capture something like, if you're trying to like freeze the wings of an insect in flight, you're never going to be able to do that at this. This is where you start to get into like some strobe lighting and much more complicated technical setups. So I always shoot at my max sync speed. I mentioned earlier, my sweet spot is f11. One of the benefits of this system, and I shoot all manual, right? So I do all manual focus and I do all manual settings on my camera, which for some people seems a little bit overwhelming. Here's the great thing about that. I shoot at f11 and I shoot at 1/250th of a second shutter speed. So those settings are pretty much taken care of. I rarely touch those unless I accidentally bump them, which happens. And then I forget about it because I use those settings, like I change those settings so infrequently that when I do bump them, I don't realize it until I get home and I'm like, why did none of these photos turn out? Oh, because I bumped up my aperture to like f18 and now I'm getting that diffraction issue I talked about earlier. So I wanted to mention something else here and I forgot. Oh, so the other settings that you typically would be aware of would be like your ISO, right? Which is your sensor's sensitivity to light. The ISO tends to be the only setting that I change when I'm out in the field. And that setting I'm going to change dependent upon my lighting conditions. So if it's super bright and I have really good light, then I'm going to change that probably to ISO 100. That's the lowest my camera will go. As it starts to get darker, if I'm shooting in a shady area, I might bump that up to like ISO 400 or 800, just dependent upon the situation. But again, I'm using my camera's flash. So the flash is taking care of a lot of the lighting for me. Anybody know what's in this photo? What's happening in this photo? And you can just type into the chat if anybody has an idea. I will tell you it's an insect that most of us probably don't like very much, at least part of what's happening in the photo. And it's a little stinky. So these are brown marmorated stink bug eggs on a leaf. Now what's cool is I didn't notice what was happening to the stink bug eggs until I brought my camera up to my eye. And I was like, oh my gosh, what's this? This is actually a little parasitoid wasp. And these parasitoid wasps lay their eggs inside the eggs of the brown marmorated stink bug. The larvae hatch and then the larvae eat the stink bug larvae, which is great. It's natural control, right? Beneficial insect taking care of a invasive species in our landscape. What's even cooler is you can see on the eye of this tiny wasp, and this wasp, they are 1.5 millimeters to 2.5 millimeters in length, so pretty small. There's a tiny little mite on the eye of the wasp. So again, you would never see this unless you could take a photo that was capable. It's not even something that you really see with your naked eye when you're looking at it. So photography is just astounding. So this is a little crab spider. I love spiders so much. Again, I used to hate them. I used to be so afraid of them. I'm actually in the process of adopting 2 pet jumping spiders, which I'm hoping will arrive sometime this week. They're being shipped from Sacramento and it's been too hot to ship them. So I should have 2 pet jumping spiders in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. So you can follow along in that journey. Some people think I'm nuts. So here's what you all are interested in, right? Here's a honeybee on goldenrod. Again, the detail that you can get in some of these things is absolutely amazing. So this was shot early in the morning. You can see some of the hairs are a little bit matted down from the dew in the landscape. Just incredible, some of the details that you can get. Every hair on the bee's eyes, just really cool. And here's one of my favorites, little tiny jumping spider, tiny jumping spider. This is one of the smaller ones that we can see in our landscape. Those great big, beautiful eyes. And this is why jumping spiders are one of my favorite things to photograph, is they're so charismatic. They're just so charismatic. And here's one of my favorite insects I've ever photographed. This is a tree hopper from the cloud forest of Ecuador that I was lucky enough to photograph almost a year ago to the date when I went to a bug photography workshop with Bugshot. So if anybody is really interested in like really learning from some of the best entomologists and macro photographers in the world, I recommend you check out Bugshot. They have a great website. They have a great Facebook group. It's a group of entomologists and photographers who take people on these amazing workshops all over the world. They were supposed to be in Brazil this fall. And of course, that's not going to happen because of COVID. I was supposed to be in Florida with them a couple months ago and that got canceled due to COVID as well, but hoping to go next year with them. Super wonderful opportunities. Here's another one of my favorite photos that I've taken too. I say that with like everything, but this is a little assassin bug nymph emerging out of its egg case. So if you've ever seen a sort of a cluster of assassin bug eggs, this is pale green assassin bug. They look like a cluster of little test tubes, and then each little tube has a little white cap on it. And when they start to emerge, those caps kind of pop off, and this little spindly-legged, bright white nymph starts to emerge out of there. Another situation where I didn't even see this nymph emerging. I had no idea what it was when I looked at it with my naked eye. And when I got my camera up at that, I was like, oh my gosh, like look at what's happening. So that's a cluster of probably, I'm guessing like 25 to 30 eggs. And I just happened to be there in the moment when that first one started to come out. I shot this actually at the Akron Zoo on some random tree. So everybody's out looking at snow leopards and like the animals on exhibit. And I'm over here like oohing and awing in some random tree about this little nymph emerging out of this egg. So I went back around to that spot about 3 hours later when we were getting ready to leave the Akron Zoo. If you've been there, it's like a nice big loop. So as we looped back around, I went to that very spot and there were like probably 15 to 20 little nymphs just all over that leaf. It was the coolest thing. So macro photography is just absolutely wonderful. So a little bit of technical information, if you're interested in this reverse lens technique with this Velo macrophyre, which again is it's a very specific size. The Mikey one that I put in here earlier is going to probably be slightly different size. With the reversed mounted 24 millimeter lens, I can get 2.6 to 1 magnification ratio. With a 40 millimeter, which is the one I use most of the time, that's the one I keep on my camera all the time, I can get 1.2 to 1 magnification ratio. So slightly greater than traditional macro. And I always like to showcase, and I always forget to get something out. I always like to showcase exactly how I use this technique because I do feel like it's kind of hard to wrap your head around when you don't see it in practice. So remember I said you have to be incredibly close to your subject in order to get it into focus. So let's say I'm walking along and I see a really cool bug on a branch or a flower. So let's say this is like the stem of a flower, and then up here on this highlighter, there's like a really cool jumping spider, right? So this is how this looks in practice. I usually will kind of pinch the stem of that flower, or if it's a branch, I hold it like this in between my fingers. And I will rest, this is where things get a little bit awkward. I will rest my camera on my wrist of my non-dominant hand as I'm holding that subject steady. And then I'll just kind of look through my camera and I find my focus. So I don't find my focus by changing anything on my lens. I don't touch anything on my lens. I find my focus by slightly moving my camera closer or further away from that subject. But I'm still resting it on my wrist because that helps provide that stabilization. If I were just to go in here and try to take a photo, 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna miss it. Sometimes I get lucky, but most of the time I can't really set up my shot. So that means a couple of things. It means that I have to be super, super stable. It means most of the time when you go in to grab whatever your insect or spider, whatever it is that you're photographing, when you grab what it is that they're sitting on, they're going to fly away, or they're going to jump away, or in the case of a beetle, they're going to roll over and play dead because that's what they do. And they're going to fall off the leaf or flower, which is super obnoxious, but it happens. But in the case that the bug stays, in the case that it's going to be super patient, then what you end up with is a really great shot because you've stabilized it so much. So a lot of people say, like, do you use a tripod? I hate tripods. I hate them. They work really, really well for some people. I find, though, that by the time you set your tripod up and get it to where you need it to be, the insect that you were photographing is like 3 miles away because, again, you have to be so close to it. So it's almost impossible to really set up your tripod. Monopods, on the other hand, could work well. I hate those too, but it's purely a personal preference for me. Does your Canon have the ability to silence the shutter? Oh my gosh, John, that's a great question that I literally don't even know the answer to. I will have to look that one up because the shutter is pretty loud on my camera. Although I've never had, well, I shouldn't say I've never had that be an issue, right? Because I don't know. Maybe the insect is spooked by that. I think more often, though, the insect would be spooked by the flash output than it would be by the sound of the shutter. And that's because, and it depends on what you're photographing, right? But from what I know, as a non-entomologist, insects and spiders and other arthropods, they sense sound differently than we do. So lots of times they sense it through like vibrations as opposed to like through ears. So it's a little bit, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to talk to some entomologists about that to see just about like how would the shutter spook them more or less than the output of the flash. But good questions. Keep these coming in. I always like questions that keep me thinking, that keep me on my toes. So let's see if you can stump me some more. So let's talk a little bit about mobile macro. So mobile macro is really great. I have an iPhone 10 and a lot of times I don't have my big camera out in the field with me, right? Like I'm on a trip, like I'm at work, we happen to be outside, like on the side of the building, there's something really cool, but I didn't bring my big camera. So what do? Well, a lot of modern cameras, a lot of modern phone cameras have great capability built in already. But in the case that you're like, I just want some more magnification, you can buy commercially made lenses and filters that just go over your camera on your phone. Some of them are universal. So some of them are like a potato chip clip with a little lens in it. So they'll just clip over your lens, which is fabulous because then the next time you upgrade your phone to a new model and all of a sudden you can't use that lens anymore if it was made specifically for your camera or for your phone model. So that's a little bit frustrating. So these next 2 photos, this one and the next one, were taken with one of the Olo clips, and I will type that in. It's a pretty popular, I feel like, mobile macro and just mobile photography brand. You can buy like wide angle and telephoto and macro lenses for your phone, and it's pretty nice. This one was taken with one of the macros that came with a set from Alo. It was specific to my phone, so that when I upgraded my phone, I could no longer use it. And it was a little bit pricey for what it was. It was about an $80 set. And I used it a couple of times and I just didn't love it. But you can get some pretty decent shots here. So you can see, some of the detail in the flower here. It's pretty good. And if you know that you're using your phone most of the time for photography, definitely spend like the $80 or $40 or whatever and invest in a nice setup, because it will be worth it. Or you can spend a lot less and you can actually just bust the lens, like the little plastic lens, out of a disposable camera. So there's a little tiny lens in here. You can kind of see, if I put my finger, you can kind of see like it magnified here. I have put bright pink duct tape around it just so that if you drop this in the grass, you would lose it forever. This bright pink duct tape allows me to find it if I drop it. But if I just hold this over my lens on my phone, I can get pretty good magnification. And this is literally busted out of a used disposable camera body. So you can see on the screen here the difference between taking a photo of this flower just with my bare camera, and then with just holding one of these lenses over top of it, you can see the increase in magnification. Now it's a little bit clunky because you do either have to hold this, or I could place like a rubber band around my whole phone so it would hold this in place. Some people would place like a little piece of Velcro on their camera and then a little piece of Velcro someplace here on this, and you could just Velcro it on so it sticks. Again, there's all kinds of different DIY things that you can do. So Randy asked, how about a movie capturing bugs in motion? With this setup in particular, I think it would be very, very difficult using mobile macro and something like this, because your depth of field is incredibly minimal, but also similar to this reverse lens setup on the SLR or the extension tube setup, you have to be so obnoxiously close to your subject to get it into focus. And I mean close, like closer than you would ever think. Like you have to be like here, like almost right on top of it to get this thing into focus. So to try and take video of a bug as it's moving would be hard. Now, if the bug wasn't moving at all, like if it was like a bee, like hanging out on a flower and it was like super like cold, maybe after a rain shower, you could go in there and it's just hanging out, kind of trying to get warm. You could go in there and probably get at least a couple seconds and it would work. So Eileen asked, could you use a regular magnifying glass? You could try that. It's going to depend on the glass or the plastic, depending on what it's made with and just how that works. I find that these smaller ones that kind of are the same size as or similar size are a little bit better than some of the super big, but you could just try it, right? It wouldn't hurt. So that's like a super cheap, kind of easy way to think about mobile macro photography. So let's talk a little bit about lighting, because lighting, as we've talked about, is a very, very important component to macro photography. And it's because of this reason. So imagine you're photographing like a landscape that has a beautiful like glacial lake and mountains in the background. You have the sky coming in. You have a light bouncing off of miles and miles worth of landscape and then coming back into your camera. You have tons of light in the landscape. Now, if it's nighttime, you're not gonna have tons of light, but like on a regular day, even if it's like cloudy, you have tons of light happening in the landscape coming into your camera. All of a sudden, when you were doing macro photography, and this is my awesome highlighter flower again, you're this close to it, you don't have a lot of light coming into your camera because your focal point is right here. So you don't have light bouncing off of like miles and miles worth of landscape, but you're right on top of your subject instead. So now you have to find a means to illuminate and provide some artificial lighting. When I got started in macro photography, like really interested in it throughout my college years, I was such a purist. I was like, I can't ever use a flash because that's not true nature photography. So we live in Ohio, right? So I would wake up, I'd be like, I'm totally going out today and I'm gonna go photograph. I used to work in the national park as a Park Service ranger in Cuyahoga Valley. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna photograph the park. And then I would wake up and guess what, it's cloudy. Well, I can't go because there's no sunshine. Like that's not fun, right? So I finally started to soften to the idea of using artificial lighting, using flash. So I started by getting this twin light flash, big, heavy piece of equipment. It works. It works so well, but it's heavy and it's clunky, and quite frankly, I hate it. And it was $900, right? $900 for a flash that I hated carrying around. So I was like, you know, that's when I kind of started to look at what are some other setups. I started to use my onboard camera flash, and then I discovered the importance of diffusion. So this is where this big clunky piece of material comes in. And there are, before we get into the more diffusion, there's ring flashes too. That's what's depicted here. The only downside that I've heard, and I've never used a ring flash myself, but the only downside that I've often heard about ring flashes is when you're photographing anything that has a reflective surface. So oftentimes like the shell of a beetle or the eyes of a bee, for example, you get this hot spot, you get this like perfect ring hot spot that appears in your photograph. And you can diffuse that. And sometimes you can diffuse it so much that you don't see it, but the diffusion is kind of tricky too. So these ring flashes work exceptionally well, but they're hard to diffuse because to diffuse the light, you have to put something in front of it. And to put something in front of a ring light that's on the end of your lens, you have to put something in front of your lens. So then you can't see anything. So that's one thing to just be wary of when you're thinking about a ring light. So what is diffusion? Diffusion is adding some materials in front of your light that help provide a softer light. So this big hunk of plastic here is literally, and this is way more expensive than it should be for what it is, but it works so well. This is a grassland sparks. I'm not sure you can see, it's backwards for me. I don't know if it's backwards for you all seeing that. So I'll type that into the chat for you. They make a number of different commercial diffusers. Grassland Spark is this one. And this just conveniently sits right in the hot shoe of my camera. So it's kind of like a cold shoe. It's not really hot. And I pop my flash up. So my flash is on inside here. I'm going to flash this. I won't do it directly at the camera, but I'm going to flash that. Ooh, I could see that. Sorry if that like hurt your eyes. So you can see the light is just a little bit diffused coming out of the camera. So it doesn't provide as hot of a spot. I've actually added several layers of styrene material in there too to diffuse it a little bit more. Because remember, I'm photographing things that are this far away. So if I were photographing something like this far away, it wouldn't seem as bright because it's a little bit further away. But when I'm this far away, that light is exceptionally bright. So there are tons of different types of DIY diffusers out there too. This is just a screen capture from Google. If you just type in DIY macro diffuser or diffusion, you can find some pretty cool things. Here's another thing that I've made that I started using within the last like year or so. This is just a piece of plastic that I have cut and sort of molded to fit on my camera. And it just kind of adds this extra sheet of diffusion in front of my flash before it would hit my subject. So my subject's gonna be down here as I'm photographing it, and this just blocks a little bit of extra light. And I have found, this is what's called a stencil blank that you can find at your craft store. It's used for creating your own stencils. And I've just cut it up and then provided a little piece of Velcro down here that just Velcros it over top of my lens. And it creates like the most perfect diffusion ever. Now you can have a little bit too much diffusion. If you're using too much diffusion material, you can start to create, sort of just starts to suck the color out of your image. So just play around and see what works for you. Not everything is gonna work well. So any questions before we kind of start to wrap up with some creative techniques? We're just gonna talk about some like general compositional things, what to think about as you're photographing bugs. Background is one of the keys in macro photography. It was a topic that eluded me for the longest time because I was so focused on getting my subject in focus that I couldn't care about anything else. I wasn't thinking about composition. I wasn't thinking about the background. And when you're photographing something like a bee, or even like if you're thinking like your beehive, it's kind of a messy situation, right? Like there could be a lot of bees in one area that you're trying to isolate. Or if you're photographing like an insect in a garden, there's a lot of like leafy and like grassy material in there. And if there's all these different lines being formed in your photograph, it can detract from the primary subject. So that's why backgrounds are so important. So tree hoppers, as I've mentioned, are one of my most favorite types of insects. This is called an oak tree hopper. From what I've heard, they're pretty common, although I've only ever found 2 colonies in my life, both of which were at Seacrest Arboretum here in Worcester, where I live. So this is an oak tree hopper. I had the great pleasure of photographing a colony over about 4 or 5 weeks. So if you've seen my TEDx talk is all about the story of the maternal care of this species of tree hopper and just how amazingly endearing it is. Like if you know nothing else or care nothing else about bugs, like please know that some species of tree hoppers take care of their young. And it is like the sweetest, most endearing thing about these species of insects. It's just so, so cool. So this is an oak tree hopper. This is the adult. This is the mother. You can see the holes underneath her wing here are where they feed. So tree hoppers are a true bug. They kind of use that straw-like mouth part to kind of stab it into the plant and then suck the juices out of the plant. They will not do a tremendous amount of damage unless your tree was like absolutely infested with them. So I know some people are like, oh no, bugs are sucking the juices out of my trees. They won't do that much damage. But notice how behind this tree hopper, she has a sort of a very dark gray, dreary background behind her. That's due to that flash fall off that we talked about very early on. So that the flash was so diffused by the time it hit whatever was in the background of her, that it was just sort of this murky green color. Now here is a different species of tree hopper, also photographed here in Worcester, bright green and yellow background. So how do you get that? Well, I literally just held a leaf behind this tree hopper as I photographed it. So that gets a little bit tricky because if you recall, I'm also holding the branch that the tree hopper's on and I'm resting my camera on my wrist. So in between my 2 fingers, I don't even know how I did it, I found a leaf on the ground and I just held it behind her, far enough away that it wouldn't be in focus because I didn't want you to see all the veins of the leaf because that detail would have detracted from the primary subject. Again, it gets a little bit complicated, but you start to learn how to be creative. So here is another photo of that tree hopper. The mama tree hopper is here on the right, and her newly emerged adult offspring is on the left. They look completely different when they are newly emerged adults. That new adult will actually darken in color and look more like that mother, that sort of mottled orange and green color over time. But I held just an oak leaf. It was September, like late September into October when I photographed this colony, and I grabbed a random oak leaf off the ground, not even paying attention really to the colors, and I held it behind the tree hoppers. And when I saw that photo, I was like, holy cow, look at that beautiful gradation from the red and the yellow to the green. It was honestly coincidental. And this is one of my favorite photographs that I've ever taken. It was such a cool moment. Sometimes that happens, not always, but sometimes. Now here's an example of a plant hopper that I photographed, nothing held in the background, so you get that stark black background, which is great because this bug is super light. It's like a light white and gray, so you get all of the details in that thing. You don't lose any of it. So photographing another white bug, when I did hold a bright green leaf behind it, notice how you don't get a lot of the detail come out of the insect wing because that background washes it right out. So play around, experiment, see what works well and what doesn't. Oftentimes, especially in the last year or two, I've been using the blue sky, or in Ohio, the gray sky often, as my primary background. So if I can position myself in relation to the insect, and oftentimes that means you're getting really, really low down to the ground, if I can position myself to have the sky in the background, it produces the most glorious background because there's nothing to worry about. You're not going to have any really distracting elements. Occasionally, like in the case of this, you get these sort of lighter puffs. Those are just clouds. So those are the clouds that you can see in the sky behind this little caterpillar that's kind of raised up on a leaf. And I've positioned it just so to have the blue sky with the clouds in the background. And then you don't have to worry about holding leaves up, or you don't have to worry about distracting elements. You just get a nice clean background, which is great. So again, all about experimentation. Of course, we always hear about the rule of thirds in photography. The rule of thirds you can use quite well with a lot of insects. Sometimes, especially if it's a head-on portrait, I like to just shoot them right down the center. But you can do some really cool stuff with the rule of thirds, keeping part of your image, a third of the image, just completely empty. And again, that has to do with positioning, thinking about what's in your background. This little ambush bug hiding out in a flower. Here's a little digger bee. This is a situation where I positioned him just right to be right up against a bright, big green leaf in my garden. And again, you kind of he's kind of in the center, but then you have this nice negative space here on the left-hand side, kind of following the rule of thirds a little bit. And you can get really literal with the rule of thirds as well. So these leaf veins kind of cut that photo into beautiful thirds there. And instead of positioning that caterpillar right down the middle, position him on one of the sort of axis of that third, that vertical line, which is really just another way to play with that. So we've talked a little bit about stability. I've kind of mentioned I don't personally like to use a tripod or a monopod, but you can try that and see if you do. You can also hold your subject. So when I say hold your subject, I don't necessarily mean like pick up a honeybee and hold the honeybee in your hand, although you can. I'm sure many of you, have had bees on you before. And quite frankly, especially on those colder days, I have bees crawl all over me, sometimes even wasps, because they're looking for that warmth in your body. So they'll crawl all over you, right? And you can take photos in that way too, but just know what you're doing, and you all do as beekeepers. But not necessarily holding your subject, right? You can hold whatever your subject is sitting on, whether it's a flower or branch or leaf, and hold that stable. And that's how you can provide some stabilization. Also, slowing your breathing down a little bit, and then keeping your elbows kind of in towards your body. Those are all just little techniques that help you provide that added stabilization to the photos. So I also shoot snowflakes. I always just like to mention this because for many years, when winter came, I went into like a deep, dark, like artistic depression because I'm like, there's no bugs for me to photograph. Like, what am I going to do all winter? And everybody was like, go shoot snowflakes. I'm like, but I hate the cold. And finally one day I was like, all right, let me just go see what I can do with snowflakes. So I created this little snowflake studio for myself, which was literally a piece of like food storage container, like a little bowl that you would like keep leftover food in. And I taped some pastel paper into the bottom of it. And then on top of that, I taped a piece of 4x6 glass that I took out of an old photo frame. And I created a little snowflake studio. And I went outside during an active snow. And so this is a picture. I didn't realize I had a picture in here. So this is a picture of my super complicated, super technical snowflake studio setup. Set it outside for about 20 minutes before I went to photograph to get that glass nice and cold so the snowflakes wouldn't just melt upon landing on it. And lo and behold, the same setup that I use to photograph bugs, you can use to photograph insects. Photograph snowflakes, which is really, really quite amazing. And snowflakes are really fantastic. So temperatures do have to be cold enough that the snow isn't melting immediately. And even as I usually have a paper towel in my pocket, and as it snows down, I isolate a few snowflakes, capture them, and then I wipe the glass clean. Even just the friction of wiping that glass plate clean with that paper towel warms up the glass enough that snow will melt as soon as it hits it. So then you kind of have to cool down the glass a little bit again. So Jamie asked if I could explain focus stacking, and this is a good time for that because so many snowflake photographers use focus stacking as a technique. A lot of the greatest, most well-known snowflake photographers actually use black backgrounds to photograph on. Some of them will catch the snowflakes on like velvet or on like a knit glove that's black, and they actually shoot the snowflake on an angle. So rather than photographing the outline of the snowflake, as I've done here, they photograph the reflection of light on the snowflake, which produces a really stunning result. But because they're photographing it on an angle, only a slice of that snowflake ends up being in focus. So instead of taking one photo, they might take 10 or 12 photos of that snowflake at different focal points, right? Different planes of focus. And then they stack them together you can even use Photoshop for this, or you can buy a dedicated software like Xyrene Stacker. And you put all of those photos in the program. The program intelligently is able to pick out which parts of which photos are in focus, and then it takes those in focus pieces and stacks them into one big photo. So what you end up with is a photo that instead of just one sliver is in focus, you end up with a final product that's actually a result of 12 photos or whatever, and you get a really perfectly in focus photo. So I mentioned people focus stacking with 10 or 12 images. Some insect photographers have focus stacked with hundreds of thousands of images, and it's the most incredible result. I can't imagine how tedious it is to do something like this. It's all an automated system. It's it's always with a dead insect, like a pinned specimen. And they have it all on this super highly complicated, like technical system that's all automated using the computer. So they have the pinned insect, and then they have this like camera on some sort of like axis, and they've programmed that axis to move around in specific points, and it will photograph like a fraction of a millimeter of that insect at a time. So, and at different focal lengths or different focal planes as well. So for any like fraction of a millimeter section of that insect, you might have 100 photographs, each at like a different plane. So what you get when you stack those hundreds of thousands of images into one is like the highest resolution photo you can imagine. But it's big enough that you can put this thing, you can like plaster it like on a museum wall, and you see this insect, this small, small creature in such incredible, beautiful detail. We see these things in a way that we've never before seen them. It's the most incredible, incredible form of insect photography. There's actually a guy who has done a TED Talk about that. I can't remember his name, but his work is absolutely stunning. So I'd encourage you to look at that. So here's just some final photographs of our snowflakes. Lots of really cool detail in there. It's a fun thing to do during those winter months. And this is sort of the last thing, I think the last thing that I want to say here is that I do a lot of conservation work. I love insects and spiders. They're incredibly important components, and you all know that as beekeepers, incredibly important components of our ecosystems. We rely, like our human health relies a lot on these creatures, but the health of our planet relies on them. And you probably all know that insects are experiencing massive declines today, which is incredibly scary. Photography can serve as a starting point for people to begin to understand these creatures. And when they begin to understand them, they can begin to appreciate them. And when they begin to appreciate them, they can begin to conserve them, right? That appreciation can lead to conservation and sustainability in ways that maybe people didn't care about before. Like I said, I used to hate bugs, and then I started photographing them. And now I'm getting 2 jumping spiders as pets, which is like the furthest thing that I thought I would ever in my life do 10 years ago. But here we are. And I am just so excited. I always like to wrap up my presentations by saying that I photograph insects because I love them and because I care about sustainability and conservation. So I photograph healthy living insects in their natural habitat. I only photograph in situ unless I happen to be taking a spider outside of inside my house to outside my house. So I catch the spider, I might snap a few shots, and then I take that spider safely outside. But I photograph things in their natural habitat because I care about them and I care about their health. I don't freeze, I don't kill, I don't pin, and I don't otherwise like capture or contain insects. A lot of entomologists will do that because it's in the process of studying these insects so that we can understand more about them and understand how to conserve them. And I think that's okay. I think in the scientific endeavor, it's okay to have to get those shots in order for us to understand these creatures in a way that can lead to their conservation and for us to understand their needs. But for me personally, as a conservation photographer, I don't prefer that. And yes, Sam Droge at USGS, and he has absolutely incredible images that he has opened up for use in presentations and a number of other uses. I'm friends with him on Facebook, and his work is just incredible, incredible. So John also asked, what image quality do I shoot? So I shoot at, I don't know specifically. I do know that I shoot RAW. That's another question that often comes up is, do you shoot RAW or JPEG? I only shoot RAW because I do some minimal post-processing. I use Photoshop, and that usually consists of like a little bit of like bringing up the shadows, a little bit of sharpening, usually taking out those the dust specks that are in every photo because my camera is dirty and needs to be cleaned. I don't know how to do that. So I usually remove those little dust specks too. And John also asks, what are the names for your pet jumping spiders? What will they be? So I know my lady is going to be Rosie. And I have on Facebook right now a poll of what I should name her male friend that the breeder is going to send me as well, which was an unexpected surprise. So I still need a name for her male friend. If you have any, drop those in the comments too. So Rosie, and right now my favorite is Roscoe, but I'm still open to suggestions. And she has her own Facebook page that I'm starting to. So it's called Rosie the Spood. You can find her on Facebook. So you can find me at Chasing Bugs, chasingbugs.com. I do have several blog posts that I haven't been super active on my website, I'll be perfectly honest, but I do have several blog posts that take you through sort of a tutorial on how to use the reverse lens technique, how to use the extension tubes with one of these pancake lenses So if you're like, I have no idea what that woman said, and I have no, like she was speaking just like so gobbledygook, you can go back and look at that blog post and I'll kind of walk you through each of those things. So with that, I will open it up for any questions or discussion from you all. Where do I take my camera for lens cleaning? So I am up in Worcester, Ohio, and I have traditionally taken my camera up to Dodds in Cleveland, usually because they host they have like a big event twice a year, and they usually offer free camera cleaning, and I just haven't gotten around to doing it for a long time. Actually, I just got this camera less than a year ago. So the Canon 90D came out last fall, and I got it. So I've had it less than a year, but man, it's pretty dirty. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know what I did, but there are some dust specks in every single photograph that I have to remove. It happens. So what other questions do you have for me?
While some of you are getting ready for questions, I'm going to launch a poll, and this is for OSBA. We want your feedback because we're going to have the fall conference on Zoom. And if you thought the length of the presentation was too short, just right, too long, did you learn anything from this? And then just 7 quick questions. And if anybody else has questions for Diane, you're welcome to put that in.
And thanks
Now that
so
great
much,
presentation,
everybody.
and you must have done an absolute perfect job because there's no other questions.
People probably are just like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what she said. It's a lot of information, and it's a lot of technical information. And you know what, it took me years. It really took me years to kind of master and wrap my head around. But feel free, like I said, you can follow me on Facebook. Feel free to reach out with any questions. You can email me. I will put my email address in the chat as well. I'll put my work email address for Ohio State. So wolf.540@osu.edu. And I think the biggest thing is just, experiment. Like, go out and experiment. The great thing about digital photography as opposed to film is you can just take a ton of photos, right? And you can review them as you're in the field so you can see what's working and what's not working. Laura asked, are there other photo stacking programs? The one is called, I feel like I'm spelling this right, Zyrene Stacker. I know that's the one a lot of people use. I don't do a ton of stacking generally because I'm hand holding my photos, or I'm hand holding my camera as I photograph. So in order to effectively stack, you have to basically get multiple images of the same subject where the subject hasn't moved. The only thing that's changed is where your focal point is. And that's very difficult to do with live creatures, right? Because things move, or even just your handshake, right? You move a lot. So stacking is very difficult. I do recommend, I'll type his name too, because some of you have probably heard of him. Thomas Shahan has been such an inspiration for me. He's well known for his jumping spider photographs, and I had just the absolute amazing experience of meeting him in Ecuador last year when I went to Bugshot. Very, very amazing opportunity to shoot next to him. But he has done a lot of reverse lens work. He also does quite a bit of photo stacking, and he does handheld, which is incredible. So you can view some of his work on YouTube if you just search Thomas Shahan. He has some really, and his voice is so soothing. So you can just listen to him present. He's outside. He's showing some of his photos. It's just incredible. So stacking is available on Mac and Windows. So what else? Oh, you got a varroa mite. Yeah, so actually I've taken some photos, this is a little bit different, of mason bees with pollen mites. And these techniques that allow you to get so up close and personal to what you're photographing, it's really unique because then you can actually showcase, this is what a mason bee covered in pollen mites looks like. And I sent that out onto the web, and actually some people were like, how dare you be keeping mason bee houses and not doing a proper job of like cleaning them and taking care of them. And quite frankly, I didn't know what I'd gotten myself into, but so many people were like, oh my gosh, like I'm learning from your experience, and thank you so much for sharing that, because now we know what not to do, right? These like commercial bee houses kind of exploded in the last couple of years. Everybody was buying them. You can find them in any like Lowe's or Home Depot, but a lot of times they lack the education, the information that you need to do that in a healthy way. So by sharing my experiences, like here's a bee covered in mites because I did something really stupid. Don't do what I did. It's a really good learning opportunity for people. So how did I get my photos? Oh, somebody asked about my gallery behind me. So I have my insect gallery of photos behind me. I was actually supposed to have my first ever gallery exhibition in Cuyahoga Valley National Park earlier this summer. It was like late March. And of course that got canceled because of COVID. And I was like, you know what, darn it. If I can't have a gallery presentation there, I'm going to have a gallery presentation that I can look at every single day when I step into my office. I got these actually from Shutterfly. They are the mounted wall art that you can often find for 50% off or more. And they are, what size are they? I can't remember what size they are. 16 by 24 maybe, but they're great. They're fabulous. I love them. John also asked, do I shoot any black and white? I actually don't shoot any black and white. I don't. And I think partly because I love showing the colors in the creatures that I photograph. So you can see a lot of the backgrounds are really bright. I like to use that bright blue sky. And yeah, I love colors. I love like the positivity. I think that rainbow of colors brings from the insect world. So no, I don't do black and white. The spider movie clips. Thanks, Shelly. One thing that I recently discovered, so if you follow me on Facebook, was it just last night or the night before, I posted a photo of a jumping spider in my house actually chasing a laser, which I read about in a more of a scientific capacity, like the way that spiders' vision works. And I was like, oh, I'm really curious if this will work. So I took out a little laser pointer and sure enough, this spider chased it just like a cat. So it's kind of a neat thing. So yeah, so that's what I have. I know we're kind of coming up on 8:30 here. Like I said, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you have. And I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability. And thanks so much. Thank you again, Jamie, for having me here this evening.
You're very welcome. And thank you everybody for your input tonight. The survey, I'm going to go ahead and end that and reshare that with everybody. That was off to everybody. You've done a beautiful job, Diane. Thank you very much for all the information. And for myself, I'll share one photo that I've been taking. I just bought a 90 millimeter for my Sony, and I've been playing with the weeds out back.
Nice. That's
awesome. Why I said, I wish I would have met you about a year and a half ago when I started buying all these expensive toys and knowing that I could have done it a lot cheaper.
So that's a beautiful photo, Jamie. That's really, really well done.
Thank you. So everybody tonight, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you very much, Diane, for the great, I love this kind of thing. And everybody had great feedback from it. And remember to take the survey. There's a lot of other things that are coming up before the end of the year, so you're welcome. We want your input to be able to find the speakers that you guys want. I want to make this about the beekeepers, not about anything else or not one person, but I want feedback from everybody. If you'd like to get onto the newsletter, please go join our mailing list. That link is down below. If you missed part of this presentation, it was recorded. We'll put it up on YouTube in about a week and a half after we do the editing and get everything ready. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Diane, again. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And if you guys have questions, she is the person to talk to.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.